Desmond Avery was 38 years old when his wife took nearly everything he had spent years building. The house he had renovated room by room with his own hands. The savings account he had spent most of his adult life growing carefully. The marriage he had supported by putting his own plans on hold whenever something else seemed more urgent. Corinne walked away with the house, most of the money, and the life Desmond thought they had been protecting together. Then she walked directly into the arms of Sterling Wade, the man who had been helping her plan the exit long before Desmond knew there was an exit to plan. Desmond left with his car, his tools, his engineering license, and several notebooks filled with ideas. Ideas Corinne had never once asked him about. She told Sterling that Desmond would not fight hard, that he would absorb the loss, disappear quietly, and rebuild somewhere else. Because that was simply the kind of man he was. For a long time, it looked as though she had been exactly right. Then one morning, Corinne turned on the television. A business segment was playing, the kind of segment that catches your attention because a name appears on the screen that you know too well. Then a face, the face of someone you once woke up beside. Desmond Avery, founder of Avery Structural Group. Corinne stopped moving. The correspondent was talking about federal infrastructure contracts, major projects, and a company that had grown from one engineer with a notebook into a respected regional firm. Corinne picked up her phone. She called Desmond. No answer. She called again. Still nothing. She kept calling, again and again. Desmond never answered once. What Corinne did not understand, and what she could not have imagined when she signed the divorce papers years earlier, was what Desmond had been quietly building while nobody was paying attention. Before we get into the story, tell me where you're watching from and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The house on Delmer Court always looked different near the end of the day. Desmond noticed it whenever he came home. The brick caught the remaining light and held it for a while, warm and amber, before the evening settled across the neighborhood. When Desmond first bought the place, someone had painted over the original brick with a flat beige color. Matt hated it. Not because beige was offensive, because the paint had hidden what the house actually was. So Desmond stripped it himself. Weekend after weekend, layer after layer. He worked carefully until the old clay color returned, until the front of the house looked like what had been underneath the entire time. That was how Desmond approached most things. He believed the real structure mattered more than the surface. He pulled his Toyota Camry into the driveway and turned off the engine. For a moment, he remained behind the wheel. Desmond was the lead structural engineer at Mercer & Dunn, a firm where he had spent more than a decade building a career in rooms that rarely placed his name on anything visible. His work existed inside calculations, plans, load paths, and decisions that prevented buildings from failing. It was a particular kind of professional invisibility. Most people did not notice structural engineers when everything worked. They noticed them when something did not. Nothing had gone wrong in Desmond's career. Was respected, reliable, precise. But he was also quiet enough that people often benefited from his work without thinking much about who had done it. Desmond got out of the car and rolled his shoulders. The evening air carried the smell of cut grass and barbecue from somewhere nearby. He paused on the front walk. The porch boards were ones he had replaced himself. The window trim had been repainted by his own hand. The front door had once hung slightly out of alignment, just enough to irritate him every time he used it. He rehung it until it sat true. A man's work is his word made tangible. That was his father, Vernon Avery, speaking from somewhere in Desmond's memory. Vernon had repeated that sentence so many times when Desmond was growing up that it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like physics. Like load capacity, like tensile strength, you either built something correctly or you built something that would eventually fail. There was no useful third option. Desmond went inside. The kitchen light was on. Corinne stood at the counter with her phone in one hand. Her thumb moved across the screen. She looked up when he entered and gave him the bright expression she always seemed able to switch on in the first seconds of a room. Hey, you. Hey. Desmond set his work bag near the door. How was your day? Slow, Corinne said. She placed her phone face down on the counter without losing the smile. Had a client walk through that went nowhere. She doesn't know what she wants. Corinne ran a home staging company called Bellamy Home Design. The business had been operating for more than a year. And according to Corinne, Many of the clients did not know what they wanted. A lot of property visits went nowhere. A lot of conversations failed to become contracts. Desmond had funded the launch himself. The business registration, the website, the first inventory of furniture and decorative pieces Corinne needed for staged listings. I had written the money out of their joint savings without hesitation. I believed in her the same way he believed in a well-drawn plan. You invest in the foundation, then you trust the structure to follow. The structure had not followed, at least not yet. Desmond never said that to her. The business would find its footing or it would not. Either way, the household did not depend on it. Desmond's salary carried most of the financial weight. I understood that role without resentment. A good structure did not complain about the load it was designed to hold. "Sorry, the walkthrough didn't work out," he said. He opened the refrigerator and scanned what was inside. "Chicken, peppers, half an onion. I can make stir-fry." "Whatever you want," Corinne replied. She had already returned to her phone. There was a version of Corinne that Desmond had fallen in love with. She knew how to move through a room with confidence. She remembered people's names. She laughed at the right moments. She could make someone feel, briefly and completely, like the most interesting person in the space. Desmond had admired that about her. He still did, in an abstract way, but the distance between them had been growing. He had explained it to himself as a difference in personality. Corinne was social, external, always looking for movement, conversation, opportunity. Desmond was quieter, interior, still. He assumed Corinne needed more stimulation than a quiet house, and a husband who often returned from work tired. He had repeated that explanation so many times that it became structural in its own way. A beam he had installed inside his own mind to keep the marriage from sagging under questions he did not want to ask. Desmond filled a pot with water. That was when he noticed it, not like an alarm, more like a small inconsistency, the kind of thing his training had taught him to recognize before he could explain why it mattered. I was washing his hands when a faint smell reached him through the warm kitchen air. Cologne, not his. Soft now, settled. The kind of scent that remains after the person wearing it has already been gone for a while. Desmond kept the water running slightly longer than necessary. Then he shut it off. He dried his hands on the dish towel. Behind him, Corinne continued scrolling. Desmond picked up the cutting board. He began slicing peppers. He said nothing. The family tablet had been giving them trouble for a while. A sinking problem. Nothing dramatic. Just the kind of low-level technical issue people postpone until a quiet morning gives them time to deal with it. Eventually, Desmond had that morning. Corinne was asleep. The house was still. Desmond sat at the kitchen table with coffee beside him and the tablet open in front of him. He moved through the settings patiently. The device was switching between his account and a shared family account they had created years earlier for photos and calendars. Desmond adjusted the configuration. The screen refreshed. A message thread appeared. Not his, Corinne's. The contact name consisted of 2 initials. Desmond stared at the screen and understood immediately that he should probably close it. There is a brief moment when a person can choose not to know something. A short space between suspicion and certainty. Desmond sat in the kitchen he had rebuilt with his own hands and allowed that moment to pass. Then he read. The message history stretched back more than a year. It was not the frantic language of a new affair. Not breathless. Not reckless. Not 2 people shocked by their own behavior. It was settled. Organized. The language of people who had already made a decision and were now handling logistics. The initials belonged to Sterling Wade. The name appeared fully in older messages. Sterling was a real estate developer. That became obvious from the references scattered throughout the thread. Property closings, investment timelines, construction projects, financing. But there were also references to Desmond, not always by name. Your husband, the current arrangement, the situation, clinical language, the language of people discussing a problem they expected to remove. Sterling wrote with confidence. Brief instructions, clear assumptions. I treated the situation like a project. Camden handles the legal side, one message said. Camden Bellamy was Corinne's brother, a divorce attorney. Sterling wrote that Camden knew how to structure the asset claims. They discussed waiting until the timing favored Corinne. They talked about Desmond's salary. They talked about a consulting firm Desmond had mentioned wanting to build one day. They discussed trying to characterize that future business as a marital asset. future earnings, speculative value, something Camden might know how to frame. Desmond set down his coffee carefully. Then he continued reading. The thread became denser. Near daily messages. An exit being assembled piece by piece. Sterling advising. Corinne confirming. Both of them refining timing. Language and strategy. Desmond realized that what he was reading was not primarily an affair. It was a business plan. The affair was part of it, but the plan was larger. Then Desmond found the message he would remember long after everything else changed. Corinne had written it. Short, certain, almost casual. He won't fight it the way a harder man would. He'll be hurt, and he'll let it go. That's just who he is. Desmond read the sentence twice. There was no rage in Corinne's wording. No cruelty for the sake of cruelty. That made it worse. Cruelty would at least have meant she understood the wound. Instead, she was describing his character as a usable condition. His patience, his restraint, his unwillingness to create chaos. All of it had been converted into part of the plan. Desmond picked up his phone. He photographed every message visible on the tablet. Then he scrolled. Photographed again. Scroll. Photograph. He continued until he had documented the entire accessible thread. Then he closed the application, powered down the tablet, placed it beside the coffee. Desmond sat with both hands flat on the kitchen table. Outside, the neighborhood was waking. A car started somewhere nearby. Birds moved in the oak tree beyond the fence. Nothing in the kitchen had changed. Same cabinets, same countertop, same sink beneath the window. Same room Desmond had renovated carefully until every surface sat the way he wanted. But the meaning of the room had changed. He sat there and allowed himself to understand what he now knew. Not suspected, not feared. Knew. Later, after Corinne was asleep, Desmond opened the household savings account. He had not reviewed it closely in a long time. Corinne handled most of the routine account management. Desmond trusted her. He had repeated that phrase to himself often. I trust her to manage it. At some point, trust had become his reason not to look. The account should have held roughly $47,000. It held about $9,200. Desmond stared at this balance for a long time. Then he opened the transaction history. Withdrawals. Different amounts. Different intervals. Nothing large enough or regular enough to trigger an obvious alert. The smallest was only a few $100s. The largest was a little over $3,000. The transfers had started many months earlier and had continued without stopping. Desmond counted them, dozens of separate withdrawals. Later, when he reconstructed the complete history, the missing amount came to roughly $37,800 from the joint savings. That number mattered because it was not a rough emotional estimate. It was a documented total. Money that had been there. Money that was now somewhere else. Every transfer went to the same external account. Desmond copied the account reference and searched the available public records. A limited liability company appeared. Bellamy Design Holdings, registered under Corinne's maiden name. Then Desmond searched the registered management connection. Wade Property Management Group, Sterling's company. Desmond placed his phone face down. The kitchen was dark except for the small light above the stove. That amber glow reminded him of the brick on the front of the house. Brick he had uncovered layer by layer until the truth underneath became visible. He sat there for a long time. I did not sleep much afterward, but that was private. Desmond drove to work the way he always did. Same route, same calm movements, both hands on the steering wheel. His mind processed the problem quietly. He had a name. He had messages. He had financial records. He had a limited liability company tied to Corinne and Sterling. What he needed next was an attorney. Desmond waited until he reached the parking garage at work. Then he called Ellis Monroe, a structural project manager he trusted. Ellis had gone through a difficult divorce and emerged with enough perspective to give useful advice. More importantly, Corinne did not know him well. Desmond asked one question. "The attorney you used, is she good?" Ellis answered immediately. "She's the reason I kept my retirement account." Desmond wrote down the name. Nia Okafor. He called her office. A cancellation allowed him to meet quickly. Desmond accepted the appointment. Then he went to work. The retainer came from an account Corinne had never used. A savings account Desmond opened when he was young. His father had encouraged it. Not as a secret from a future spouse. As a foundation. Vernon told him that life moved in ways nobody could fully plan for. A person needed something set aside, not because love required suspicion, because self-respect included preparation. Desmond had added money slowly over the years, a few $100s whenever he could. It was not a fortune, but it was enough for the moment his father had always said might eventually come. Nia Okafor's office was high in a downtown building. She was compact, direct, and wore reading glasses she removed whenever she wanted to look at someone without anything between them. Desmond showed her the screenshots, the account history, the limited liability company registration, the connection to Sterling's property management business. Nia read without interrupting. When Desmond finished, she removed her glasses. How long have you been married? Several years. Has she filed yet? No. Then we move first. Nia picked up a pen. Tell me everything. Don't leave out anything because you think it makes you look foolish or careless. I need the whole structure. Desmond almost smiled at the word structure. Then he told her everything. Hai went home and continued living normally. For weeks, Desmond cooked dinner, asked Corinne about her day, watched television beside her on the couch they once chose together. Hai did not perform happiness. Hai did not perform ignorance. He simply continued, calm, deliberate, giving Corinne no reason to accelerate whatever timeline Sterling and Camden had designed. In the mornings before Corinne woke, Desmond worked on the case. He logged every piece of evidence in a spiral notebook. Source, file, location, description. The screenshots were placed in chronological order. The financial statements were cross-referenced with the date the limited liability company was created. Desmond researched public property records tied to Sterling, high-traced development entities, ownership changes, deeds, management companies. Hai did not guess. He followed documents. Everything went to Nia through secure folders. She responded briefly whenever she received a new batch. Got it. That was enough. Eventually, divorce papers arrived, not at the house, at Desmond's office. A process server walked into the lobby of Mercer & Dunn and asked for Desmond by name. Co-workers moved through the same space, coffee in hand, files under arms, ordinary business happening around him. The papers came in a manila envelope. The return address belonged to Camden Bellamy, Corinne's brother. Desmond signed the acknowledgement, thanked the process server, then returned to his desk. I understood the message inside the location. Serving him at work was not necessary. It was psychological, public enough to make him the person being acted upon. Corinne moved first. Desmond reacted. Sterling understood positioning. So did Camden. Desmond opened the envelope. He read every page. Then he sent a copy to Nia. The divorce became expensive. Camden was thorough and aggressive, in the precise professional way of someone who believed his client's version of events and had been given a plan to execute. The case dragged on for months. He argued over the house, the savings, the notebooks, especially the notebooks. For years, Desmond had written ideas for a structural consulting firm he dreamed of starting someday. Corinne had rarely asked what was inside them. Now her legal team treated those pages as evidence of future earning potential. A business that did not yet exist was discussed as though it already carried value. The argument became another source of legal cost. Desmond fought where Nia advised him to fight. I did not fight everything. That was partly financial, partly strategic. Litigation consumed money. Camden had more billable hours available than Desmond had cash to answer. There were filings, valuations, responses, and legal arguments over property character. The house became one of the hardest losses. Desmond had renovated it room by room. But renovation and ownership were not the same thing in the courtroom. The judge ultimately awarded Corinne the house and most of what remained in the joint savings. The speculative business valuation was challenged and reduced, but even winning that argument cost Desmond time and legal fees. He paid from the emergency foundation account his father had encouraged him to build. The retainer had already taken several $1,000s. More filings followed, more invoices. By the end, the foundation account was nearly empty. That was the point when Desmond understood a difficult truth about legal fights. Being right about part of the story did not mean the process would be cheap enough to preserve everything. Sometimes survival meant choosing which parts of the structure could still be saved. When the divorce finally ended, Desmond left with his car, his tools, his engineering license, his notebooks, and not much else. I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment on the east side. The carpet was an ugly mustard color. The radiator knocked at night like something trapped inside the wall. Desmond placed the notebooks on the kitchen counter. He did not own a table yet. Just a counter, a lamp, several boxes. He stood in the middle of the apartment and looked at what remained. Corinne had been right about one thing. Desmond did not collapse. He rebuilt. Not quickly, not easily, but he rebuilt. He incorporated Avery Structural Group less than a month after moving into the apartment. The notebooks finally became something more than plans. Desmond stopped waiting for perfect conditions. He started with whatever work he could get. Residential inspections, small commercial consultations, foundation assessments. Projects larger firms ignored because the fees were too small. One early church foundation assessment paid only about $1,400 and consumed several full weekends. Desmond still treated it like a federal contract. He measured, photographed, calculated, wrote the report himself, then followed up until the client understood exactly what needed to be repaired. Desmond did everything himself. Site visits, calculations, reports, invoices, follow-up, taxes, proposals. He answered emails from the small apartment. He carried drawings between the kitchen counter and the only desk he could fit against the wall. The radiator knocked through the night while he prepared reports. He learned software tasks he had previously handed to administrative staff. He learned what it meant to chase an unpaid invoice politely because there was nobody else in accounting. I took every contract the company could physically complete without sacrificing quality. There was no team to hide behind. If the report was late, it was Desmond's fault. If the calculation was wrong, his name was on it. If the client was impressed, there was nobody else to receive the credit. That accountability became useful. For the first time in his professional life, the invisible parts of his work had a direct line to his own future. One project came from Rochelle Bennett. Rochelle had watched the divorce from close enough to understand what Desmond lost. She was not interested in offering sympathy that did nothing. She offered work. The property was a 4-story mixed-use building that needed a complete structural assessment before an investor group would release additional funding. Desmond treated the assignment as though the future of his company depended on it. In a way, it did. He reviewed framing, connections, load paths, existing modifications. During the inspection, he found a deficiency in the upper floor framing that previous contractors had missed. It was not dramatic from the outside. That was exactly why it mattered. Left unresolved, the issue could have produced expensive problems later. Desmond documented the condition clearly and developed a remediation plan. The fix saved Rochelle's investor group roughly $40,000 in costs they might otherwise have discovered after construction had moved further ahead. Rochelle did not send Desmond a long congratulatory message. She sent his contact information to 3 people. For her, that was stronger praise. She offered work. Rochelle sent Desmond's information to several people almost immediately. Those people sent it to others. Within months, Avery Structural Group had municipal work, retaining walls, sidewalk infrastructure, public assessments, unglamorous projects, exactly the kind of work that rewarded precision rather than presentation. The municipal work became a turning point because it showed potential clients that Avery Structural Group could handle institutional documentation, deadlines, inspections, and public accountability. Desmond did not become wealthy overnight. The company simply became more credible. One finished project made the next proposal easier. One satisfied client became another introduction. One accurate report became proof that the next contract was not a gamble. Desmond built the company one reliable result at a time. He still called his father regularly. The calls were usually short. Vernon did not use the telephone as a place for long emotional processing. I wanted to know one thing. Was his son still standing? Desmond would tell him about the work, the money, the difficult week, the next contract. Vernon usually gave the same answer. Keep going. That was enough. The first major federal bid changed everything. The proposal required technical capability, documentation, financial discipline, and proof that Avery Structural Group could deliver institutional reliability. Desmond worked on it for many weeks. The document was not glamorous. It was hundreds of small promises that had to be believable together. Staff qualifications, Past performance, insurance, quality control, scheduling, risk management, technical methodology. Desmond knew that larger firms could afford teams whose only job was writing proposals. Avery's structural group could not. So he worked late, then reviewed the work again when he was less tired. I treated the submission the way he treated structural design. A weak page could damage confidence in a strong section. An unsupported claim was the proposal equivalent of a load with nowhere to go. He removed anything that sounded impressive but could not be proved. He checked every figure. The schedule reflected what the team could actually deliver, rather than what he hoped the client wanted to hear. That discipline became part of the company's reputation later. Avery's structural group did not promise miracles. It promised work it could stand behind. Rochelle, read the proposal before submission. Other firms don't have a chance, she told him. Desmond thought that was generous. Rochelle thought it was obvious. Avery's structural group won the contract. Then another opportunity followed. The team grew. One person became several. Several became 11. 11 became dozens. Eventually, roughly 70 people worked inside the organization. The company expanded into infrastructure work across multiple states. 2 active federal contracts gave Avery Structural Group a kind of credibility that small firms often spend years trying to earn. Project activity climbed into the tens of millions of dollars. By the time the television profile appeared, the correspondent described roughly $40 million in major contract work tied to the company's rapid rise. Desmond heard those numbers differently from the audience. Viewers heard scale. He heard every small project that came before it. Every church foundation, every retaining wall, every proposal written alone, every client who took a chance before the company had a polished office. Desmond never developed the habit of announcing himself. I did not need to. He preferred the work to speak first. Eventually, a journalist covering infrastructure projects heard about Avery Structural Group. The journalist contacted Desmond through his business email. A profile was proposed. Desmond almost declined. Howe was busy. The company already knew what it was worth. Rochelle disagreed. Don't disrespect the building by hiding it, she told him. So Desmond agreed. By then, Avery Structural Group had already grown first to 11 people, and then far beyond that early stage. 2 federal contracts were active. The firm's reputation had begun traveling farther than Desmond was pushing it himself. The journalist was interested in that contrast. A founder who rarely chased attention. A company whose work kept creating reasons for people to notice. During the interview, Desmond did not tell a dramatic story about the divorce. I talked about engineering. He talked about reliable systems. I talked about why infrastructure work requires patience because the public experiences the consequences of shortcuts long after the person who made the shortcut has moved on. The producer kept returning to the notebooks. One man, one apartment, one set of plans that had once existed without employees, clients, or a guarantee they would become anything. Desmond understood why that made good television. But to him, the notebooks were not symbols. They were simply where the work began. The feature eventually aired. Corinne knew nothing about it. Desmond had no reason to inform her. Years had passed. He rarely thought about her. His life had become full again. Not full in the way it had been before. Different work. Employees. Projects. People depending on him because he had chosen the responsibility. Not because someone had quietly assigned it to him. Corinne happened to be home when the feature played on television. She was in the kitchen of the house she received in the divorce. The house Desmond had stripped, repaired, painted, replanked, restored. She had the television on in the background while making coffee. At first, she did not watch. Then she heard a name. Avery Structural Group. She looked up. Then she saw Desmond. Same calm face. Same controlled presence. A hard hat on his head while he walked through a project site. The correspondent described federal contracts. A company that had grown from a single engineer with notebooks into a firm responsible for major infrastructure work. The segment explained that the company had generated tens of millions of dollars in project value and had become known for disciplined technical work. The correspondent said Desmond was not the kind of man who announced himself. He built until the building spoke for him. Corinne's coffee overflowed. She set down the phone in her hand. Then she picked it up again. She called Desmond. No answer. She called again. No answer. Something inside her could not stop. She moved from the kitchen to the living room. Called again. And again. The missed calls accumulated until there were 57 of them. 57 separate attempts to reach a man she had once been certain would simply disappear into the background of his own life. Corinne called from the kitchen, from the living room, from the couch inside the house Desmond had rebuilt with his own hands. Each unanswered call made the silence feel less accidental. Desmond's voicemail answered every time. Calm, brief. You've reached Desmond Avery. Leave a message. Corinne did not leave one. Desmond was in a board meeting while the calls came in. His phone sat face down on the conference table. I was working through a federal project review with his team. Load analysis, overpass design, technical questions, real work. The kind of work that required full attention. He did not notice the phone vibrating. When he finally looked at it later, the screen showed a long column of missed calls from a number he still recognized. Corinne. 57 missed calls, most spaced only minutes apart. Desmond stared at the list. There had been a time when one call from Corinne could rearrange his entire day. A problem at the house, a question about money, a business expense, a bad client meeting. I had trained himself to respond quickly because that was what dependable people did. Now the phone showed 57 attempts, and Desmond felt no emergency inside them. Only history asking for access. Then he turned the phone toward Rochelle, who sat across from him at lunch. She looked at the screen, one eyebrow lifted, slowly. That was her entire reaction. Desmond put the phone away. I'll have the salmon, he told the server. And more water, please. Then he returned to the rest of his day. The work waiting for him was a highway overpass review in Georgia. Desmond had been walking his team through a load analysis when Corinne's calls accumulated. Later, he reopened the calculations and flagged 2 discrepancies that needed another look. The corrections were not catastrophic. That was exactly why they mattered. Structural mistakes are easiest to correct before they become visible in concrete and steel. Desmond sent a clear email to the engineers responsible. Specific, professional, no embarrassment. No unnecessary softness either. The math was the math. Then he walked through the office, not to stand over anyone, to see what people were working on, to remain present enough that a young engineer could ask a question before uncertainty turned into a hidden problem. By then, the company had roughly 70 employees. Desmond knew that scale could create the same kind of invisibility he had experienced earlier in his career if leadership stopped paying attention. He did not want a firm where the people whose work kept everything standing became noticeable only when something failed. So he learned names. I asked what people needed. He noticed who was taking on too much. He encouraged senior staff to mentor the younger engineers rather than treat them as cheap labor. For Desmond, that was not separate from engineering. It was another form of load distribution. A company becomes fragile when too much responsibility sits on the same few people. The office Avery Structural Group occupied was high enough above the city that Desmond could see cranes, steel frames, and unfinished structures from the windows. The floor still surprised him sometimes, not because it was luxurious. It was not. Glass walls, work tables, project boards, a break room where someone almost always started another pot of coffee before the previous one was finished. What moved Desmond was the fact that the space belonged to a company that had once existed only in his notebooks. Years earlier, those notebooks had sat on the counter of an apartment where the radiator knocked through the night. Now project managers carried marked-up drawings through a real office. Engineers argued respectfully over calculations. Interns asked questions in conference rooms. Clients arrived for meetings and saw Avery Structural Group printed on the glass. Desmond had chosen the location partly for the view. I wanted his employees to be able to look out and see the city's skeleton. Cranes, frames, half-finished buildings, structures becoming visible one decision at a time. It reminded him that finished things often hide how much uncertain work came before them. I had chosen the location partly for that view. He liked seeing buildings in progress. A structure halfway complete tells the truth about itself. The skeleton is still visible. Nothing is hidden behind finished walls. Desmond arrived each morning, set down his coffee, opened his portfolio, and worked. The company had grown far beyond the first apartment. Dozens of people worked there now. Desmond knew most of their names. I knew who had families, who carried student debt, who was mentoring interns, who was still trying to gain enough confidence to speak during project meetings. He did not think of paying attention to those things as generosity. He thought of it as accurate accounting. You invest in a structure. The structure holds. Desmond remembered what it felt like to be invisible inside rooms where his work mattered. He did not want his employees to feel the same way. He learned people's names, not only the senior engineers, the new hires, the administrative staff, the interns. He knew which younger engineers were still paying student loans, which project managers had children, which employees were mentoring someone less experienced. He tried to stay close enough to the work that people knew he was available, but not so close that his presence turned into surveillance. That balance came from engineering too. A good structure supports without crushing what it carries. Desmond tried to lead the same way. He walked the floor, stopped beside a drawing, asked what someone was seeing, listened before correcting. When a calculation was wrong, he said so clearly, not harshly. Soft language did not change mathematics, but respect changed whether people felt safe enough to bring a mistake forward before it became a larger problem. That mattered to Desmond. I had built the company from work people trusted. I wanted the culture to be built from the same material. He did not want his employees to feel the same way. He walked the office floor without hovering. He checked in, asked questions, stayed available. A good engineer did not stand over the work. He stood near it. That distinction mattered. Desmond did not spend much time thinking about Corinne's calls. Then Rochelle came into his office carrying a manila folder. She closed the door behind her. You have a few minutes? Yeah. Rochelle sat across from him. She placed the folder on the desk. It's about Sterling. Desmond's expression did not change. His current financial position. Rochelle continued. I've been looking at it for a while. There are some things you need to see. Desmond opened the folder. The first page was a clean financial overview. Rochelle had experience with property due diligence. She knew how to build documents that allowed information to speak without decoration. Desmond Reed, Sterling Wade's development portfolio, carried an estimated $31 million in active debt spread across 9 properties. 3 of those properties had been refinanced. Sterling had pulled against existing equity to fund new acquisitions. 2 major development projects were running significantly behind the schedules promised to investors. The delays were not minor. They were measured in many weeks. One of Sterling's primary financial backers, a private development fund based in Atlanta, had quietly reduced its committed capital on a co-financed project by roughly 30%. There had been no public announcement. Rochelle knew because a contact inside the fund had flagged the change. The numbers did not describe collapse. Not yet. They described strain. A portfolio held together by the expectation that the next closing, next refinance, and next investor commitment would arrive before the previous pressure became visible. Rochelle watched Desmond Reed. He's running the whole operation on momentum, she said. As long as investors believe the portfolio is performing, confidence holds. But underneath that, the foundation is weaker than it looks. Desmond turned the page. The next sheet came from a title search. Property records, ownership codes, transfer dates, legal descriptions. Desmond read it once, then again. Walk me through this. Rochelle leaned forward. The limited liability company registered under Corinne's maiden name, the one tied to Sterling's management company, had only been active for several months. During that short window, it acquired 2 investment properties, a duplex on the east side, a commercial unit outside the city. The down payments came from the limited liability company's capital account. Rochelle pointed to the purchase records. The first acquisition occurred before Corinne filed for divorce. The second also closed before any divorce papers existed. That timing mattered. The properties were already being purchased with the diverted capital, while Desmond still believed the savings account was intact and the marriage was simply distant. The down payments came from the limited liability company's capital account. The same account the transfers went into, Desmond said. Yes. Desmond studied the property dates. Both acquisitions occurred before Corinne filed for divorce. Then he traced the next stage. After the divorce was completed, both properties were transferred out of the limited liability company and into Sterling's sole ownership portfolio. The transfers did not happen years later after an unrelated business decision. They followed the divorce closely enough to make the sequence difficult to dismiss. Then the limited liability company was dissolved soon after the final property transfer. By the time someone looking only at the post-divorce picture might have searched for the entity, the company no longer held the assets. The assets sat cleanly inside Sterling's portfolio. On paper, the temporary company had almost disappeared. The money trail had not. Rochelle spoke carefully. By the time anyone might have looked closely after the divorce, the company no longer held the properties. Sterling did. Desmond looked at the numbers. The money drained from the joint savings. The down payment amounts. Separate columns. Separate documents. But the figures aligned in a way an engineer could not ignore. Nearly all the missing money could be connected to the capital used for those acquisitions. Desmond rested both hands on the folder. What word would Nia use for this? Rochelle looked directly at him. Actionable, I asked her informally before I brought this to you. She did not hesitate. Desmond closed the folder. He did not speak immediately. I was not suppressing emotion. I was organizing information. Rochelle understood the difference. Set up a meeting with Nia, Desmond said. As soon as she can see us. I'll call her. Thank you. Desmond meant it completely. Rochelle stood. At the door, she paused. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something else. Then she decided against it. That was Rochelle. She understood that not every feeling became more useful because it was spoken. Desmond drove home with the folder in his portfolio. I took a longer route than necessary. When he parked, he stayed in the car for a while. Then he opened his phone. Corinne's old message was still stored there. I had moved it from one device to the next over the years, not because he reread it often. Because he believed documentation mattered. He won't fight it the way a harder man would. He'll be hurt and he'll let it go. That's just who he is. Desmond read it once, then locked the phone. Nia's conference room was plain. Loo table, chairs, window, nothing decorative, trying to make the work seem more important than it was. Nia was already there when Desmond and Rochelle arrived. Reading glasses on, legal pad open, pen ready. She shook their hands and sat. I've reviewed the preliminary material Rochelle sent, she said. But I want everything from the beginning. Desmond opened his portfolio. He had organized the evidence chronologically with an index. He walked Nia through the original tablet discovery, the sinking issue, the message thread, the screenshots, then the bank records, dozens of separate transfers taken from the joint savings, each small enough to avoid obvious attention. Then the limited liability company registration, Corinne's maiden name, Sterling's property management company connected to it. Then Rochelle's title search, the acquisition of the investment properties, the source of the down payments, the later transfers into Sterling's sole ownership, the dissolution of this company, Niemade notes. Then she removed her glasses and looked at the documents covering the table. This is a strong civil case, she said. Fraud. Conversion of marital assets, potential concealment through the limited liability company structure. The timeline is clear enough that a court will understand what happened. Desmond listened. Nia continued. Corinne appears as the registered owner of the entity used to receive the funds. Sterling appears as the direct financial beneficiary after the properties moved into his portfolio. Both names go on the filing. That's what I want, Desmond said. Nia nodded. You said you had another question. Desmond folded his hands. Sterling is carrying a development portfolio that depends heavily on investor confidence. He's leveraged. At least one major backer has already reduced support. He paused. What does a public civil fraud filing do to a developer in that position? Nia did not hesitate. It makes every serious investor he has call their lawyer. She said it without drama. Institutional money does not ignore fraud litigation tied directly to a developer's asset history. They review exposure. Commitments get delayed. Due diligence gets deeper. Funding can pause while people decide whether the risk is acceptable. Nia looked at Desmond. A developer operating mainly on momentum has difficulty absorbing that kind of interruption. Desmond sat quietly. Then he said 2 words. File it. Nia wrote something down. One more thing, Desmond said. Camden Bellamy. I want him to see the documents before the filing becomes public. Not to negotiate. Not to warn Corinne. I want him to look at the evidence without his sister's version standing between him and what actually happened. Nia studied Desmond. I can arrange that. Good. The meeting ended. Outside, Desmond and Rochelle walked toward the parking structure. Rochelle stopped near the entrance. She looked at him. Again, she had the expression of someone who had decided not to say what she felt, but wanted him to know the feeling existed. Desmond nodded. That was enough. Later, Desmond called his father. The filing is moving forward, he told Vernon. Nia has everything. Vernon was quiet. Then he said there was something he had been holding on to for years. Desmond waited. Vernon told him about a Chamber of Commerce dinner he had attended before the divorce. An old acquaintance had invited him. There were contractors, developers, business owners, people who might need renovation or structural work. Near the end of the evening, someone introduced Vernon to Sterling Wade. Big smile, expensive suit, the kind of man who entered a room like he already owned part of it. The acquaintance told Sterling that Vernon was Desmond Avery's father. Mentioned that Desmond worked in structural engineering. Sterling shook Vernon's hand, looked him directly in the eye. Desmond's a good engineer, he said, solid guy. Then Sterling moved on. Desmond did not move while his father spoke. Vernon continued. He shook my hand. Son. Said your name out loud. And the whole time, he already knew exactly what he was doing with Corinne. Desmond stood near the window in his apartment. The city below was moving. Indifferent. He placed one hand against the glass. Cold. Solid. He stayed quiet. The anger was there. Of course it was. Low. Steady. But something else mattered more. Clarity. Sterling had met Desmond's father and felt no discomfort strong enough to change course. Not because Sterling was careless, because Desmond had never registered to him as someone who would become a threat to the plan. Why didn't you tell me? Desmond asked. Vernon answered honestly. You were already down. I didn't know what that would do to you. I wasn't going to hand you more weight before you had solid footing. Then you got your footing. And I kept waiting for the moment when it would help more than it hurt. Desmond let out a slow breath. This is the right moment. Vernon was quiet. You were right to wait, Desmond said. The two men stayed on the line without filling the silence. They did not need to. Camden Bellamy arrived at Nia's office for the courtesy meeting. Grey suit, no tie, professional expression. He sat across from Desmond and Nia. Desmond placed the documentation in front of him. Same numbered index, same chronological order. Nia did not narrate. He let Camden read. Pages turned quietly. Camden's expression changed gradually. By the time he reached the limited liability company documents and title transfers, the face looking down at the papers was not the face that had entered the room. I didn't know about this company, Camden said. I looked at Desmond. I want you to understand that. I didn't know about the transfers. I know, Desmond replied. Camden seemed surprised by the lack of accusation. Corinne told me the marriage had been dead for years before she filed, he said. He stopped, reorganized his thoughts. She told me you were both going through the motions. She said Sterling came afterward. That he wasn't the cause. Just what happened after the marriage was already gone. Desmond looked at him directly. I know what she told you. Nothing else was necessary. Camden stared at the papers. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, thanked Nia. At the door, he paused, looked back. I seemed about to say something more, then left. Desmond sat in the conference room for a moment after the door closed. Then he took out his phone. Corinne's number was still in his contacts. He called. She answered quickly. Desmond. Her voice was careful. Come to my father's house for dinner, he said. There was silence. Then Corinne agreed. The porch light was already on when Corinne arrived at Vernon Avery's house. She sat inside her car before getting out. The house looked the same. White trim, small garden, the porch she had walked across countless times during the marriage. For years, she had entered that house without knocking. Now she rang the bell. Somewhere inside herself, she understood that she no longer belonged to the category of people who simply walked in. Vernon opened the door. He looked at Corinne the way he always had. Steady, unreadable. He stepped aside. The dining room table was set with his good dishes, blue and white with a thin gold rim. Corinne had only seen them on important family occasions. The sight affected her more than she expected. Desmond was already seated. He stood when she entered, not theatrically, simply because that was how Vernon raised him. Corinne looked at Desmond. He seemed the same. He also seemed completely different. The steadiness had always been there. But during the marriage, there had been softness inside it. a natural bend toward her. That part was gone. Desmond was not hard. He was finished, like a structure after the final connection had been secured. Nothing left to adjust. Corinne sat across from him. Vernon brought dinner. Roast chicken, green beans, rice. They served their plates. The first part of the meal was awkward. Corinne asked about the office building she saw in the television feature. Desmond answered plainly. The size, the layout, the build-out. No boasting. Corinne asked about Rochelle. She's well, Desmond said. The words moved carefully across the table. Corinne had expected anger. She had prepared for it. On the drive over, she had imagined accusations and practiced responses. She knew how to answer anger. Anger gave her something to push against. Desmond did not give her that. Nayate answered, listened, present, unhurried. Vernon spoke very little. The silence coming from him made Corinne aware of exactly where she was sitting. After the meal, Desmond reached beside his chair and placed a small packet in front of Corinne. Several pages clipped together. Read it, he said. Corinne read. The limited liability company. The transfers. The investment properties. The dates. The transfer of those properties into Sterling's sole portfolio. The dissolution of the company. The pages converted years of choices into a visible sequence. No longer separate decisions. No longer explanations. A construction. A plan. Corinne finished the last page. She did not look up immediately. Sterling structured most of it, she said carefully. He told me it was standard. He said it was how people protect themselves before a divorce. It went further than I thought it would. Corinne. Desmond's voice was quiet. She stopped. You sent the messages, he said. I read them. You weren't being pushed. You were planning. The room was still. Corinne started crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, no performance in it. The tears came from the moment a version of herself she had maintained for years finally lost the structure holding it upright. She covered part of her mouth, looked down. Desmond did not move toward her. I did not move away. He waited. Eventually, the crying slowed. Then Desmond spoke. The filing stands. Sterling is the primary financial target because the properties ended up in his ownership. Your attorney and Nia can work through what your position will be. This dinner is not a negotiation. Desmond stood. One hand rested briefly on the back of his chair. Sterling told you I wouldn't fight it. Corinne looked at him. Desmond's expression remained steady. I was right about one part. I rebuilt. Desmond said goodnight to his father. Then he left. The front door closed. Vernon remained at the table with Corinne. He stacked empty plates slowly, then folded his hands. You sat at this table for years, he said. There was no cruelty in his voice. Sit with what you did in this house before you leave it. Vernon stood, carried the plates into the kitchen. Water began running. Dishes touched softly in the sink. Corinne remained alone beneath the dining room light. The civil fraud filing became public. Sterling learned about it from his attorney and opened the complaint himself. Page after page. Every transfer cited. Every property record attached. Every date connected to another document. Bank statements. Title filings. Limited liability company records. Ownership transfers. The structure was difficult to attack because it had been assembled the same way Desmond approached engineering, from the foundation upward. Nothing essential left to assumption. Sterling had seen legal filings before. Aggressive ones. Messy ones. Documents that looked dangerous until lawyers started pulling at weak points. This one was different. It was patient. Documented. Complete enough to force questions. Sterling called investors. I had spent years accumulating the kind of professional relationships that were supposed to act as insulation when a project became complicated. I knew developers who had been sued before. I knew lenders who understood that litigation could be part of doing business at scale. Normally, a strong network gave a developer time, a phone call, a meeting, a chance to explain. This was different because the complaint was not about a zoning dispute or a contractor disagreement. It alleged that money diverted from a marriage had been routed through a temporary company used to acquire property and then moved into Sterling's portfolio. That was the kind of allegation investors could not treat as background noise. The people he trusted most, relationships built over years. I expected concern but also support. What he received was professional distance. Commitments would need review. Exposure needed analysis. Additional due diligence would be required. Sterling understood what that meant immediately. The investors had already started talking to one another. They were already doing the math. Other calls did not go much better. The problem became larger because Desmond's name now carried weight in some of the same professional networks Sterling needed. Avery Structural Group had federal work, public recognition, a reputation for technical integrity. Nobody wanted to be the person who casually dismissed a fraud filing tied to a firm and founder the market increasingly respected. Sterling's momentum began slowing. One development slipped into technical default when a lender that had been patient decided it no longer wanted to wait. Funding tightened. Sterling and his attorney discussed options. The cleanest option required selling an asset. One of the investment properties acquired through the limited liability company had to be sold quickly. Markets punish urgency. Sterling accepted less than the property might have brought under normal conditions. He sold an asset purchased with money that had not been his in order to cover a shortage created by exposure of how the asset had been purchased. The symmetry was not lost on him. Then Sterling called Corinne. His voice was almost businesslike. "This isn't working. The situation has become too complicated. I think we both know this arrangement has run its course." Corinne said his name. Only once. A question more than a word. Sterling told her she needed to make other living arrangements. Then he ended the call. For a while, Corinne told almost nobody. She went to work, came home, moved through the rooms of the house Desmond had renovated one by one. Crown molding, fireplace, floors, trim, brick. Everywhere she looked, there was evidence of his hands. Eventually, Corinne called her mother, Maribel Bellamy. She explained the filing. Sterling, the property sale, the breakup. Maribel listened. Then she asked a practical question. "Have you spoken to Camden about what the financial consequences could be for you?" Corinne sat in the living room. She looked at the house. For the first time, she saw the situation not as a collection of choices that had each seemed manageable when made. She saw the finished thing. Edges, weight, consequences, the structure of what she had built. Her mother continued speaking. Corinne placed the phone face down beside her. She did not pick it up again for a while. Desmond was busy at a job site, a project rising from what had once been an empty lot. Steel, concrete, possibility. He walked the perimeter with his hard hat tucked beneath one arm, slow, deliberate, reading the frame. Some parts of him had never changed. The civil case eventually resolved. Nia called Desmond and explained the terms without drama. Corinne and Sterling were required to liquidate the remaining investment property connected to the scheme. The full proceeds were directed toward Desmond's recovery. Interest was calculated from the original transfers. Legal fees were included. The court also considered the equity in the house Corinne had received in the original divorce. That house had once been treated as part of the settlement that left Desmond starting over in a one-bedroom apartment. Now its value became a part of the fraud recovery calculation. The equity could no longer remain protected from what the later evidence established. Eventually, Corinne no longer owned the home. For Desmond, that result carried an uncomfortable symmetry. He had once watched the house disappear from his life through a divorce judgment. Now its value was being pulled back into the legal equation because of money that had been hidden before that judgment. He did not interpret that as the universe restoring perfect balance. Nothing restored the years. Nothing gave back the version of the marriage he had believed in. The judgment simply corrected what the evidence allowed the court to correct. Desmond listened to Nia. The result was substantial, but it did not feel like receiving a prize. It felt like an accounting correction made years after the original entries had been hidden. The remaining investment property had to be sold. The proceeds had to be returned. Interest recognized that Desmond had been deprived of the use of that money. Legal fees recognized what it had cost to prove where the money went. The house equity connected the later fraud judgment back to the most visible asset Desmond had lost in the original divorce. Nothing about that made the earlier years disappear. It simply meant the final legal record now reflected facts the first court had never been given a chance to see. When she finished, he said thank you. Then he sat quietly. No celebration, no victory speech. He called only two people, Rochelle and Vernon. Rochelle said, "Good." Vernon was quiet. Then he told Desmond to come for dinner. That was enough. Sterling's portfolio contracted by roughly 40% from its peak. I was not destroyed. Life rarely resolves into perfect punishment, but he became smaller in the way that mattered most to him. Properties were sold. Financing became harder. Projects that once relied on easy confidence had to survive much more aggressive review. The number itself mattered less than what it represented. For a man who built his identity around acquiring, expanding, and rarely being the person forced to retreat, a 40% contraction was not merely financial. It was a mirror. His reputation no longer opened every door without explanation. Investors asked more questions. Due diligence became deeper. New deals required more reassurance. For a man who built his identity around acquiring things, moving quickly, and rarely being the person who lost, the reduction in his influence mattered beyond the numbers. Desmond did not take pleasure in it. He simply noted the facts, then moved on. Camden Bellamy changed too. He continued practicing law, more quietly. I took less aggressive divorce work and stayed away from the kind of cases that required him to repeat a client's story without asking enough questions. Desmond did not know whether that change came from conscience or strategy. He did not spend much time wondering. Avery Structural Group continued growing. Success changed what Desmond was able to ask of the company. At first, every dollar had gone back into survival. Software, insurance, payroll, equipment, office rent, travel. Eventually, there was room for a different question. What could the company build that would still matter even if Desmond's own name disappeared from the story? That question became the scholarship and apprenticeship program. Desmond thought about young engineers entering a profession where talent did not always arrive with access. He remembered being the person whose calculations mattered more than his name. He remembered how long it took to find people who treated mentorship as part of the profession rather than a favor. I wanted the next generation to have something more structured, so the company funded several engineering students from historically black colleges and universities. The students did not receive only checks. They received paid placements inside Avery Structural Group, real assignments, real mentors, senior staff members who reviewed their work, explained mistakes, and showed them how engineering decisions moved from a classroom equation into a physical structure carrying real people. The program paired financial help with experience because Desmond believed one without the other left too much unsupported. Desmond named the program after his father before telling Vernon. That was the one part Vernon did not like. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," Desmond replied. At the first ceremony, 8 students stood inside the main conference room wearing the kind of clothes people wear when they want to look ready for an opportunity they still cannot quite believe has arrived. 8 envelopes waited for them. 8 apprenticeships. 8 chances to walk into professional rooms with support already behind them. Vernon sat in the front row in his best charcoal suit, the one he usually saved for church, graduations, and occasions he believed deserved respect. He did not look entirely comfortable hearing a program named after him. That was part of why Desmond had not asked permission first. If he had asked, Vernon would have refused. Not because he was not proud, because he had never believed his ordinary discipline deserved public recognition. Desmond disagreed. The program existed because of things Vernon taught him long before there was a company. Build correctly. Keep a foundation. Do not confuse quiet with weakness. Keep going. Vernon sat in the front row in his best suit. I watched his son move through the room. Desmond spoke to students, introduced mentors, shook hands, answered questions. He carried himself with the ease of someone who had finally stopped waiting for another person to confirm that he belonged in the room he had built. After most people left, Vernon placed one hand on Desmond's shoulder. I kept it there. No speech, no lesson, no need. The gesture carried enough. Later, Desmond attended an infrastructure summit that raised money for public works projects in underserved communities. Engineers, architects, city planners, developers, design firms. Desmond had been invited to speak. His talk focused on load distribution and community investment. I explained that structures fail when too much responsibility is concentrated in too few points. The same principle appears in neighborhoods, roads, bridges, drainage, public facilities. When investment disappears for too long, the visible failure often arrives years after the original neglect. Desmond kept the speech technical because that was who he was. But the room understood the broader point. Infrastructure was not only concrete and steel. It was a record of what a community decided was worth supporting. The applause lasted longer than Desmond expected. He stood at the podium for a second, unsure what to do with it. Then he nodded and stepped away. After the event, near the ballroom exit, he met an architect named Delaney Cross. She introduced herself by the work first. "I'm an architect." Not a firm name, not a title designed to impress. The work. Desmond liked that. Delaney had an unhurried way of speaking. The kind of person who seemed to have learned that conclusions did not improve simply because they were reached quickly. They began talking about bridge design, municipal funding gaps, old neighborhoods, the difference between repairing a structure and rebuilding one. Neither of them moved toward the exit when they originally intended to. The conversation went on longer than either expected. Eventually, they exchanged cards, then walked into the cool air of the parking structure. Desmond drove home quietly, not excited in the frantic way younger versions of him might have been. Interested, open, but unhurried. I had learned not to rush things worth building correctly. Later, Desmond stood at the base of a steel frame on another job site. He placed one palm against a beam, cold, solid, exactly where it belonged. Above him, the building rose into the sky, every connection intentional, every load transferred somewhere capable of carrying it. A structure built correctly does not need to announce its strength. It simply holds. Corinne once said Desmond would be hurt and rebuild. She was right about that. What she misunderstood was what rebuilding meant. She imagined rebuilding as proof that the loss would not matter, as though a strong man could be stripped of what he built because he was capable of surviving afterward. But surviving harm does not make the harm harmless. Strength does not cancel betrayal. Patience does not make exploitation acceptable. And a quiet person is not the same thing as a powerless person. Desmond lost things he genuinely valued, a home he had restored, savings he earned, years he could not recover. He also learned something difficult about the way people sometimes interpret kindness. When someone sees patience as weakness, they may begin believing there is no cost to crossing a line. When someone sees steadiness as passivity, they may mistake restraint for permission. Desmond did not become cruel because of that lesson. I did not decide trust was foolish. He did not become obsessed with making Sterling or Corinne suffer. Instead, he became more precise about boundaries. There is a difference between forgiving and pretending nothing happened. There is a difference between moving forward and surrendering the truth. There is a difference between refusing revenge and refusing accountability. Desmond allowed the law to address what could be documented. I let evidence carry the weight. I did not need to invent anything. The transfers existed. The company existed. The property purchases existed. The title changes existed. The messages existed. Truth became powerful because it had been preserved carefully. That is one of the quiet lessons in his story. When emotions are high, patience can protect us from becoming the very thing we are trying to escape. Desmond waited until he understood the structure. Then he acted. That did not mean he felt nothing. He felt anger, grief, humiliation, loss. The difference was that he did not let those feelings make decisions that evidence could make better. There was another lesson too. A second chance does not always arrive looking like the restoration of what was lost. Sometimes the house does not come back. Sometimes the relationship cannot be repaired. Sometimes the old life is finished. The second chance may be a one-bedroom apartment with ugly carpet and a notebook on the counter. It may be the first small client who trusts you, the first invoice, the first employee, the first project someone recommends you for because you did the work correctly. A second chance may begin so quietly that nobody recognizes it as one. Desmond's did. He built Avery Structural Group the same way he rebuilt everything else. One decision at a time, one project at a time. No shortcuts, no dramatic announcement. He also learned that success does not have to become revenge. The television feature did not matter because Corinne saw it. The federal contracts did not matter because Sterling lost investor confidence. The scholarship program did not matter because it proved Desmond had become important. Those things mattered because they reflected the life Desmond wanted to build after the marriage ended. A life where his work had room to grow. A company where people were seen. A program that gave young engineers the kind of support he once needed. A relationship with his father that became something he honored publicly. And perhaps, eventually, room for someone new. Someone he would not rush. Someone who would have to meet the man he had become rather than the man he used to be. Forgiveness for Desmond did not mean inviting Corinne back into his life. It meant reaching a point where her choices no longer organized his days. He could remember what happened without living inside it. He could hold people accountable without needing their downfall to become his source of happiness. He could walk onto a job site, place his hand against a steel beam, and think about the building instead of the divorce. That was freedom. Not forgetting, not pretending. Freedom. The ability to keep building without asking the past for permission. Desmond looked up at the steel rising above him. Every beam carried weight. Every connection transferred pressure. Every foundation disappeared beneath the visible building, doing the most important work where almost nobody could see it. That image had followed Desmond through almost every part of his life. During the marriage, he thought strength meant carrying whatever weight arrived without complaint. During the divorce, he learned that strength also meant knowing when a load had been placed on him unfairly. During the early years of the company, strength meant doing small work carefully when nobody important was watching. Later, when the contracts became larger and the company became visible, strength meant refusing to confuse recognition with worth. The work mattered before the television cameras arrived. The scholarship mattered even if no journalist ever wrote about it. Vernon's hand on his shoulder mattered more than an article. Rochelle's first referral mattered more than applause. The young engineers inside Avery Structural Group mattered because they were building futures of their own. Desmond understood something else now. People often imagine rebuilding as a return to the person someone used to be. I did not want that. The man who entered the divorce had been loyal, hard-working, patient and kind. Those were not flaws. But he had also believed that being dependable meant absorbing more than his share without asking whether the arrangement was fair. The man standing beneath the steel frame was still loyal, still hard-working, still patient, still kind. But now those qualities had boundaries around them. I could help without disappearing. I could love without surrendering judgment. He could forgive without reopening doors that needed to remain closed. He could be generous without allowing someone else to write the terms of his generosity. That was not hardness. It was maturity. His father had been right. A man's work was his word made tangible. Desmond's life had become that too. Quiet, measured, strong enough to hold what he chose to carry, and finally wise enough to know what he no longer had to carry at all. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I have 2 more stories waiting for you, and I think you'll really enjoy them.